Exodus 15, 20 through 21. A few verses prior to this, Moses and the children of Israel sang a song to the Lord. It had something to do with a horse and his rider being tossed into the sea. Exodus 15, 20 and 21 is the first example we have of ancient liturgy, something that is maintained to this day, when Miriam grabs her tambourine and with a procession she leads the women of the children of Israel by declaring, what's the first verse in there? Verse 20, whoever has it. Verse 20 of 15.
And Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels in their hands.
Okay. And they declared, did you continue on?
And Miriam answered them, singing unto the Lord, for he hath triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea.
Amen. And it is because of this example why we have the modern construct of the synagogue, which is the chazan, or the cantor, the one who traditionally leads the congregation in prayers. It's patterned after Miriam leading the women in that procession. Very important to note, and that is the first biblical example of ancient liturgy. And of course, it was spoken in Hebrew. The rabbis teach that it is permissible to pray in any language that you can understand, yet they stress the importance of praying in Hebrew for some of the reasons that we stated above here, because of the sacredness of the language. Still, you may say to yourself that in the midst of these prayers, I don't know what I'm saying, even if I'm reading the transliteration. Maybe you feel that due to a lack of understanding, those prayers don't seem to have the same impact for you in the Hebrew, perhaps. I've heard that from people. Well, here's a little story for you that may help change that perspective if that's one that you have. An ancient tale speaks of a young, uneducated Jewish boy who wanted to pray but did not understand any Hebrew, so he began to recite the only Hebrew that he knew, which were the letters of the alphabet. For us, the ABCs. One day he was reciting these letters, and a rabbi came to him in confusion and asked him, "Why are you praying in this manner?" The little boy replied, "The Holy One, blessed be He, knows my heart. I give him the letters, and he puts together all the words." So, as you can imagine, as it is with tongues, we oftentimes don't understand the things that we are saying. It is deep, calling unto deep, according to the Psalms. An angelic language, so Hebrew is considered here to be an angelic language, God has given it to us as a gift to human beings. And even though we don't understand what it may say, still, God puts all the words together. He indeed knows our heart. So, who is this for? Well, you may say, I'm not Jewish, and maybe you feel that these fixed prayers are void of spirit. Have you ever heard anybody say that liturgy is legalistic? It has a very legalistic nature in background, and it is void of spirit. I've heard people say that before, that it's not as spiritual as free prayer. Some people say, well, you know, many of these prayers were established by the rabbis that weren't believers in Yeshua, and so, well, why should we say these things? Well, the book of Acts portrays a very different reality. It does show us that it is for Jews, and not only for Jews, but Jews who also believe in Yeshua. As we see in Acts 2:42, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to the prayers, plural. Now, the they here are the 3,000 who came to faith. Those were Jews who were living in the diaspora at the time and had come for Shavuot, for the festival. And via the power of the Ruach and the flames and the various languages that were being spoken, they came to faith in the power of Messiah. Yet they still continue in the teachings, the traditions, the prayers, the breaking of bread, and fellowship. Acts chapter 3, verse 1, Shimon, Peter, and Yochanan, John, were going up to the temple at the 9th hour, which we'll come to find out is the mincha prayer, the afternoon prayer at 3 o'clock, which was the hour of prayers. People have often asked, well, why did the disciples go to the temple? Well, wasn't Yeshua the temple? Didn't he say that he was going to destroy these things? Well, the reality was that the temple still held a lot of importance in the eyes of Messianic believers. And you find that in Paul's journeys also, as he desires to come back and sacrifice and do all of those things. So you see very quickly that these things were never passed away, but that they maintained their level of importance. So they didn't come to the temple just to spread the good news, as you see in the book of Acts, but they came to participate in the prayers. Okay? And it's not just for Jews, but it's also for grafted in non-Jews, as you see in Acts chapter 10, verse 30. Cornelius answered, 3 days ago this time I was at afternoon prayers in my house. And as you continue on the text, when suddenly a man in shining clothes stood in front of me and said, God has heard your prayers and remembered your acts of charity. So as you can see, it's a little bit presumptuous to argue that established prayers are somehow spiritual or less spiritual than other prayers. And at the same time, I have to qualify this by saying that I'm not going to guarantee you that a man in shining clothes is going to appear every time you are in the midst of afternoon prayers, like Cornelius. But I like to think that it's not necessarily an exception to the rule. God has heard your prayers and remembered your acts of charity. If there was no merit to these traditions, or if they were simply the utterances of a legalistic establishment, I think it's safe to say that the first century community would have quickly separated themselves, divested themselves from such a reality. But no, we find out that they maintained these traditions. The community remained faithful to its roots, as did non-Jews, as Cornelius shows us, the God-fearers that connected themselves to God's people. So what we refer to as liturgy in Hebrew is known as tefillah. The singular, there is no Hebrew word for liturgy. That is an English creation for us to somehow relate to these prayers. Tefillot is the Hebrew word for liturgy. If you're talking to a person who speaks Hebrews, and who speaks Hebrew, and you hear the word tefillah or tefillot, you know he's talking about the liturgical prayers that we recite. Tefillah means to differentiate. Hebrew prayer is meant to clarify what truly matters in life in stark contrast to the trivialities which the world deems important. Hence the concept of sanctification. By tefillah, by prayer, you are separating what truly matters. And also I want to let you know too that don't feel as though you have to mash down notes right now, because this is all available on PDF and everything else. Anything you want, I'll send to you. I've got everything, including what I'm reading off here too. All right. But if you have a question, write it down. We have plenty of time to talk about it too. The origin of the word tefillah defines the Torah's concept of prayer, and that is, well, this is how you see prayer defined in the Hebrew language. The word for prayer, for praying, is hitpalel. Hitpalel means to pray, and it means to mediate or to intervene. Comes from the root word palal, which means to judge. So tefillah or tefillot prayers comes from this very root right here, palal. It means to judge. Interestingly, you see that the process of Hebrew prayer is dualistic, and at its core, at its root, palal, it promotes self-evaluation and decision-making. Yet at the same time, the word connotes a focus on others. You see the intervention and the mediation on behalf of others. Hebrew prayer, this is extremely important to note here, that Hebrew prayer does not focus on the individual. 99